The second topic over the West is railroads. So let's start off with this map. Before 1870, I want to get to California. Well, we're seeing from this map that's not possible. For the most part, where my cursor is, that's the Mississippi River along in here. Railroads didn't go west of the Mississippi. So if you lived up in Boston, Boston is up here, and you wanted to go down to like New York or Washington, you could get on a train and do that. That wasn't a big deal. Or if you're in Washington and want to get down to Atlanta, you could take a train. But if you want to go from New York to California, that wasn't an option. So what were your options? We've talked through this a few times now. Option number one, 18,000 miles in a boat down around South America, or boat to Central America, 100-mile walk across jungles, get a boat and go up that way. Or if you don't like boats, have fun on the Oregon Trail, Oregon/California Trail. And we spoke about this in the fall, 4 to 6 months, 2,000 miles, dangers, death. I never showed you the picture, but we talked through the story. This is the Donner Party. This was the group. There were about 120 of them. They get trapped up in the mountains in California, and it starts snowing, and it doesn't stop snowing. So they basically are camped there for the winter. They run out of food. About half of them die. The other half survive by eating the bodies of those that died. But the good news is this. After 1870, our map begins to change. In 1869, they'll build the first Continental Railroad, which is roughly this one that you see my cursor on. By 1880, 1885, somewhere in there, they have built 3 more. So people went west before the railroad, but Gold Rush, for instance, 1849, but not a lot of people went because it was too expensive, it took too long, and it was dangerous. But now with the railroad, all that's changed. So instead of maybe tens of thousands of people going west every year, hundreds of thousands are going west. And they're not all going to California. They're stopping along the way and starting new lives all along these railroad tracks. The video mentioned this from the other days. On the Oregon Trail, it took 4 to 6 months. So let's for a second say it took 5 months. There's 30 days in a month, thereabouts. 5 times 30 is 150 days. 150-day journey on the Oregon Trail. Now you can get on a train in Omaha, Nebraska, and you can be in California in 6 days. That, when we stop and think about that, that is truly remarkable. This is what got it going. It was called the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. This is when Congress agreed to fund or pay for a railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific. They had to decide where on the Missouri it was going to start and where on the Pacific it was going to end. I'll show you that in just a second. Lincoln was the president at the time, and the Civil War was going on. Just to give you some context, I think sometimes we think, well, Lincoln was dealing with slavery in the South in the war, and he wasn't doing anything else. That wasn't true. The government was doing other things during this time period. All right, so 2 railroad companies were involved. The Union Pacific was the first company, and they start in Omaha, Nebraska, and they start building west. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific, they're based in Sacramento, California, and they're going to start building east. And they're going to meet up at some point. That point is called Promontory Point, Utah. I'll show you on a map what that looks like. So Union Pacific, they're building west. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific is building east. They meet up basically today. It's really close to Salt Lake City, but there really wasn't a Salt Lake City back then. One thing I failed to mention to this point is all of these tracks that they're building, this is across wilderness. There's no cities, there's no towns, there's no people. Well, I take that back. There are Native Americans, and there's wilderness, and there's a lot of wildlife. This is all wilderness area. And as mentioned, they met at a place called Promontory Point. Okay, the big question is, how are we going to pay for this? Because this is going to cost millions and millions and millions of dollars that the government doesn't necessarily have. You also have to remember they're at war, the Civil War is going on, so they're really strapped for money. So what they do is they do something what are called subsidies. And these still exist today. This is the vocab word for the day. A subsidy is money from the United States government that's given to a private company, and that private company is then going to do something that will benefit the public. So in this case, the United States government gives money to the Union and Central Pacific Railroad companies to build a railroad, and then we can argue that railroad is going to benefit the public because we can use the railroad to go to the West. I'm trying to think of stuff today that would be subsidies. Roads, if like we're building a new highway, an airport could be a subsidy, maybe a hospital or a school. Those are the types of things we're going to think about when we talk about subsidies. Anyhow, the government doesn't have enough money. So they're going to pay them with money, but they're also going to give them land. This was actually the main form of payment. And the way it worked, for every mile the railroads built, they got $16,000. This is all back then money. They got $16,000 if the railroad was across flat land. If it was across what they called the high plains, which is not mountainous but not flat, kind of hilly, they got a little bit more because it's more expensive. If they're building across mountainous terrain, they got $48,000 because then you're talking about like bridges and tunnels and dynamite and all that stuff. So they got paid with money. Plus, for every mile that they built, they got 20 miles, 20 square miles of land. The land was given to them. So the railroad companies, when they're building these railroads, they're getting millions and millions and millions of acres of land. And the railroad companies wanted this land. I'm going to explain why on the next slide. So what would the railroad companies do with all that land? Pretty simple. They're going to take it and they're going to sell it. Some cases they'll give it away. Let me talk about selling it. So they get these huge, huge tracts of land. They're going to break it into smaller pieces, and then they're going to start selling them off. And you might think, well, who wants to buy this land? Well, farmers. Farmers want cheap land. So the railroad company sells it to them. So the railroad company gets some money in from that. But they're also, what they're doing, when they sell this land, they're gaining a customer, because the farmer is going to use the railroad to get to their farm. And then anytime they want to go travel or see someone, they're going to use the railroad and they'll have to buy a ticket again. And even better yet for the railroad companies, let's say I'm a corn farmer out in Nebraska and I grow all this corn. I need to ship my corn to the marketplace. How am I going to do that? I'm going to do it on the railroad, and the railroad's going to charge me. So in a sense, by getting all this land and selling it off, not only are they making money off that, but they're also creating future customers. I also mentioned in some cases they would give it away. And the question is, why would they give it away? Because they're getting future customers from this. They would sell what they could initially, but then they would start giving it away later. Okay, last slide, big picture. How did railroads affect the United States? This was huge. The United States was able to develop and move westward much, much quicker because of the railroad. Number one, people started moving west. For the most part, not always, but for the most part, the people moving west were farmers and ranchers. And we'll talk about this next unit. A lot of these people were immigrants from Europe that were coming over to the United States because they wanted their own farm or ranch. So the population of the western states began to grow, and we get more states out of this. Number two, natural resources were sent east to the factories. So go back to the mining. Up in the mountains in the west, they're mining gold and silver and iron ore and nickel and lead and all these things they're needed to make products. So now we're going to use the railroads, and we're going to send all those raw materials all the way back to the East Coast, because that's where the factories are, and those are going to be used to make goods that people will buy. Also being sent back east is all the products that farmers and ranchers are producing. So whether I'm growing corn or wheat, or whether I'm raising pigs or cows, I'm going to take most of that and I'm going to send that back to the East Coast, because at this point in American history, most of the